So in this lecture, let's talk about some of the different theories of emotion. It was naturalist Charles Darwin who proposed that emotions evolved because they were adaptive and allowed humans and animals to survive and reproduce. Feelings of love and affection lead people to seek mates and reproduce. Feelings of fear compel people to either fight or flee the source of danger. According to the evolutionary theory of emotion, our emotions exist because they serve this adaptive role. They motivate people to respond quickly to stimuli in the environment, which helps improve the chances of success and survival. Understanding the emotions of other people and animals also plays a crucial role in safety and survival. So if you encounter a hissing, spitting, clawing animal, chances are that you'll quickly realize that that animal is frightened or defensive and leave it well enough alone. By being able to correctly interpret the emotional displays of other people and animals, that allows you to then respond correctly to the situation and avoid danger. There's good support for emotions as rooted in evolutionary functions. Emotions are innate in humans. They emerge in our first few months of life and resemble those of other animals. Charles Darwin was actually among the first to point out that emotional expressions in human and non-human animals are often similar. And this makes sense. If emotions are evolutionary in nature, they should be universal and should therefore be recognized and expressed similarly across cultural lines. Although psychologists are not totally sure what causes feelings, there are several theories that seek to unravel the mystery behind them. So now let's talk about the discrete emotions theory, which is the idea that humans experience a small number of distinct emotions, though they may combine in many different complex ways. This should sound familiar, sort of like what we talked about in the last lecture. Advocates for discrete emotions theory propose that each basic emotion has its own biological root. So things like anger, frustration, happiness would each have a discrete basis rooted in our very biology. And related to the evolutionary approach that we just discussed, each emotion serves one or more distinctive evolutionary functions that are essentially the same in all of us. So there's a reason we have these emotions, which traces back to those beneficial functions. So disgust at rotten food may prevent us from getting sick or poisoned, while fear at the sight of a lion may help keep us from getting mauled. In contrast to discrete emotions theory, cognitive theories of emotion propose that emotions are products of thinking rather than the other way around. These theories say that there aren't distinct emotions, distinct discrete emotions. There are as many emotions as there are kinds of thought. Some of the earliest cognitive theorists were James Lange and Cannon Bard. So the James Lange theory is actually one of the best known examples of a physiological theory of emotion. Independently proposed by psychologist William James and physiologist Carl Lange, the James Lange theory of emotion suggests that emotions occur as a result of physiological reactions to the events. In other words, people experience a physiological response to an environmental stimuli, and then their interpretation of that physical response then results in an emotional experience. Say you're walking through the woods, you're out on a hike, you're having a great time, it's a nice day, then suddenly you see a giant grizzly bear. Ah! You start to tremble, your heart begins to race. The James Lange theory proposes that you will conclude that you are frightened. So you might say, I am trembling, therefore I am afraid. According to this theory, you are not trembling because you're frightened. You're frightened because you're trembling. Both James and Lange believed that while it was possible to imagine experiencing an emotion such as fear or anger, your imagined version would be a flat facsimile of the real feeling. Why, you may ask? Because the actual physiological response that they believed precipitated the emotions. It would be impossible to experience these emotions on demand. In other words, the physical reaction needs to be present in order for you to actually experience real emotion. Now, prior to James Lange's theory, the standard line of thought was that people's first reaction to perception was cognitive. So physical responses then occurred as a reaction to those cognitive thoughts. The James Lange approach instead suggested that these physiological responses occur first, and they play a major role in the experience of emotion. So this might seem tiny, like a very small distinction in the sequence of events, but the theory had an important impact on psychology and the understanding of emotions. And there are some widely accepted instances in which physiological responses do lead to experiencing emotions. Developing a panic disorder and specific phobias are two examples. So a person may experience a physiological reaction, such as becoming ill in public, which then leads to an emotional response, such as feeling anxious. If an association is formed between the situation and the emotional state, the individual may then begin avoiding anything that might trigger that particular emotion. Now, modern researchers largely discount the James Lange theory for many reasons, one of which being that neither James nor Lange based their ideas upon anything that even remotely resembled controlled experiments. Their theory was largely the result of introspection and correlational research, which, as we know, is not best practiced in scientific thinking. Another well-known physiological theory is the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion. Walter Cannon disagreed with the James Lange theory on several grounds. So first, he suggested people can experience physiological reactions linked to emotion without actually feeling those emotions. So say your heart is racing. Well, it could be because you're experiencing fear, but it could also just be because you were exercising or exerting yourself in some way. Cannon also suggested that emotional responses occur much too quickly to be simply products of physical states. When you encounter a danger in the environment, you will often feel afraid before you start to experience the physical symptoms associated with fear, such as shaking hands, rapid breathing, and a racing heart. Sort of like that prickling on the back of your neck feeling that makes you start to feel fear before you actually start to experience the physiological responses. Cannon first proposed his theory in the 1920s, and his work was later expanded on by physiologist Philip Bard in the 1930s. According to the Cannon-Bard theory of emotions, we feel emotions and experience physiological reactions, such as sweating, trembling, and muscle tension, simultaneously. More specifically, the theory proposes that emotions result when the thalamus sends a message to the brain in response to a stimulus, resulting in a physiological reaction. At the same time, the brain also receives signals triggering the emotional experience. Cannon-Bard's theory suggests that the physical and psychological experiences of emotion happen at the same time. It's not that one causes the other. Imagine you're walking to your car through a dark parking garage. It's late at night, you're all alone. And then you start to hear the sound of footsteps trailing behind you. And you see a shadowy figure slowly following you as you make your way to the car. Yikes. According to the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion, you will start to experience feelings of fear and also physical reactions at the same time. So at the same time that you start to feel scared, your heart might begin to race. You will rush to your car, dive in, lock the doors behind you, and zoom out of there to get home as fast as possible. Critics suggest that the Cannon-Bard theory places too much emphasis on the role that the thalamus plays in emotion, while largely ignoring other parts of the brain. The thalamus is part of the limbic system and does play an important role in the experience of emotions, but more recent research suggests that the process is simply more complex than the Cannon-Bard theory allows for. The basic assumption of the Cannon-Bard theory, that physical reactions do not lead to emotions, has actually been refuted by several studies. And today's research has shown that when people are asked to make a particular facial expression, such as frowning or smiling, they're also likely to experience an emotion connected to that expression. Also known as the two-factor theory of emotion, the Schachter-Singer theory is also a cognitive theory. This theory suggests that physiological arousal occurs first, and then the individual must identify the reason for this arousal in order to experience and label it as an emotion. So a stimulus leads to a physiological response that is then cognitively interpreted and labeled, then resulting in the emotion. Schachter and Singer's theory draws on both James Lange and Cannon-Bard. So like James Lange, the Schachter-Singer theory proposes that people infer emotions based on physiological responses. The critical factor is the situation and the cognitive interpretation that people use to label that emotion. Like the Cannon-Bard theory, the Schachter-Singer theory also suggests that similar physiological responses can produce varying emotions. For example, if you experience a racing heart and sweating palms during an important event, you will probably identify the emotion as anxiety. If you experience the same physical response on a date, you might interpret those responses as love, affection, or arousal. So let's take our same example from before. Imagine you're alone in a dark parking lot, you're walking towards your car. It's late at night. A strange man suddenly emerges from a nearby row and approaches you rapidly. So according to the two-factor theory, the sequence that follows would be like this. I see a strange man walking towards me. My heart is racing and I am trembling. My rapid heart rate and trembling are caused by fear. I am frightened. So the process begins with the stimulus, the strange man, which is followed by the physical arousal, rapid heartbeat and trembling. Added to this is the cognitive label associating the physical reactions of a rapid heartbeat and trembling with fear, which is immediately followed by the conscious experience of the emotion, fear. Notice how the immediate environment plays an important role in how the physical responses are identified and labeled. In the example I just gave, the dark, lonely setting and the sudden presence of an ominous stranger contribute to the identification of the emotion as fear. Now imagine that you are walking towards your car in a parking garage in the middle of the day, it's bright and sunny, and an elderly woman began to approach you. Now, several of the factors in that story are the same as the ones I just described. You're still in a parking garage, you're walking to your car, somebody's approaching you. But rather than feeling fear, now you might interpret your physical response as something like curiosity or concern if the woman seems to be in need of assistance. So the interpretation of your environment also plays a role according to the Schachter-Singer theory. According to appraisal theories of emotion, thinking must occur first before experiencing emotion. Richard Lazarus was a pioneer in this area of emotion, and this theory is also referred to as the Lazarus theory, or cognitive appraisal, or cognitive mediational theory. According to this theory, the sequence of events first involves a stimulus, followed by thought or appraisal, which then leads to the simultaneous experience of a physiological response and the emotion. So say you encounter a bear in the woods, you might immediately begin to think that you're in great danger, which then leads to the emotional experience of fear at the same time as the physical reactions associated with that flight or fight response. So I want to show you this video. It goes over a lot of what I just talked about, but I like how it explains things in a slightly different way.
So let's continue our discussion of emotions. If you remember from the previous video, emotion is made up of a series of cognitive, physiological, and behavioral responses to a stimulus. But which response comes first? And this is one of those topics that I think a lot of us take for granted. It's something that occurs in everyday life, but we generally don't break it down and think of it in these components and wonder, gee, which one comes first? So thank goodness we have psychologists who do that for us. And as you might imagine, this is a pretty complicated topic. So there isn't just one theory of emotion. There's many theories of emotion. And for our purposes, we're going to discuss 4 different theories of emotion. The first one's called the James Lange theory of emotion. And it's named after 2 researchers who both independently came up with this theory back in the 1800s. So they actually weren't working together, they just each came up with it around the same time. So in the interest of fairness, they decided to name it after both of them. So that's why it's known as the James Lange theory of emotion. And what it hypothesizes is that the experience of emotion is due to the perception of your physiologic responses. So what does that mean? Well, let's think about an example of maybe holding your pet. Let's say you have a pet cat. In holding your pet cat, it elicits the emotion of happiness. So how does it do that? Well, according to the James Lange theory of emotion, holding your pet cat causes a physiologic response of maybe increased heart rate, certain neurotransmitters change in your brain. Maybe you'll start to smile as you're holding your cat. And what makes the James Lange theory of motion unique is that they say it's the interpretation of this physiologic response that causes the emotion of happiness. So it's not actually holding your cat per se that's making you happy, it's what the cat's doing to your body that makes you feel the way you do. So it's your awareness of these processes occurring that make you realize you're happy. In another example, you could say that when you're sad, you don't cry because you're sad because you cry. It's your mind's interpretation of your physiological response. Now, you might be sitting there finding that hard to believe. And if you feel that way, it might interest you to know that there are other theories of emotion as well that sprung up because they didn't agree with this James Lange approach. One such theory is known as the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion. And these were two theorists who disagreed with the James Lange theory, and they believe there are some major flaws in the idea that physiologic responses triggered emotion. So first, they felt that a person could experience physiological arousal without feeling any particular emotion. So think about it, your heart will race when you're feeling afraid, but your heart also races if you just had a long run. So how could that be? If the physiologic response was all that was necessary to produce an emotion, shouldn't any person with a racing heart feel afraid? In that same line of thought, these researchers also noticed that many different emotions had the same patterns of physiological response. So think about like your heart racing or rapid breathing. Those accompany feelings of anger as well as excitement, and those are two totally different emotions. And lastly, they felt that the physiological response system was just too slow to produce emotions that often seem to happen almost instantly. So for example, if you hear a loud sound, maybe you'll feel fear or surprise almost instantly. And subsequent physiologic responses of your heart racing, increased muscle tone, etc., they come later. And the theory they put forth was the Cannon-Bard theory. And they believe that the physiological responses and the experience of emotion both occurred simultaneously. So you have an event occurring, which causes a physiological response as well as an emotion at the same time. So going back to the example of holding your cat, if you hold your cat, that's the event. And by holding your cat, maybe your heart rate starts to increase ever so slightly. Maybe there's some changes going on in your brain, but in terms of your neurotransmitters. And while that's happening, at the same time, you're feeling a feeling of joy. And that's the emotion that you're experiencing. But the main point here is this theory says these two actions happen at the same time. Now, another key theory of emotion is the Schachter-Singer theory of emotion. And in this view, physiological and cognitive responses, they simultaneously form the experience of emotion. More specifically, if we become physiologically aroused, we don't feel a specific emotion until we're able to label or identify the reason for the situation. So in our previous example, we spoke about holding your cat. So the event is holding your cat, which produces a physiological response of, again, maybe increased heart rate or changes in your neurotransmitter levels. But we don't necessarily feel happy until we consciously label the situation. So you identify the reason for this physiologic response, you identify the reason for the event. So you would say to yourself, this is really nice. I like holding my cat. This makes me happy. And that's what produces the emotion of happiness. It's that identification and that cognitive ability to understand what's going on that causes it. Now, another theory is known as the Lazarus theory. And that proposed that the experience of emotion depends on how the experience is cognitively appraised. Now, you might think that sounds very similar to the one we just discussed in the Schachter-Singer theory, but it's different, and I'll show you why. So we have an event, let's say, again, holding your cat. In the Lazarus theory, next comes appraisal, or labeling the situation. And what the Lazarus theory says, if we label the situation as bad, the emotion will be negative. And if we label the situation as good, the emotion will be positive. So one of the differences here is that how we label the event is completely dependent on personal experience or cultural differences and situational factors. And once this appraisal has occurred, then the emotion will occur simultaneously with the physiological response. As you can see, it is a different order of things as compared to the Schachter-Singer theory. So using our example of holding a cat, if a person's held a cat before and happened to be bitten by a cat or had a bad experience with a cat, that individual may label the situation as scary, and the emotion that will be produced is fear. But on the other hand, if someone's a cat lover, grown up with cats their whole life, they might label that situation of holding a cat as wonderful and feel joy. So it's all in the label. And the way I like to think about this is in terms of hobbies. So take skydiving, for example. Some people would label the activity of jumping out of a plane as something terrifying, and they would experience the emotion of fear. Whereas someone else who's maybe a daredevil, they would label this situation as exhilarating, and they would experience happiness. But as we can see here, the event of skydiving is the same, but it's producing two very different emotions in different people who have different outlooks on or different appraisals on the event occurring. So that's the 4 theories of emotion that we're going to discuss today.
So this chart is taken from your textbook. I'm not going to go over it in too much detail because we've already talked about the different theories, but I'm a visual person. I like to see everything laid out. So this chart takes one example of seeing a snake and shows how the different processes lay out in each of the different theories. Now, finally, factors outside of our awareness, both positive and negative, can also affect our feelings. The mirror exposure effect is a phenomenon in which repeated exposure to a stimulus makes us more likely to feel favorable towards it. Ever taste something and you're not sure if you like it, so you keep on trying it and eventually decide, I guess I do like this. I remember that happened to me once specifically. I was on a chocolate tasting tour with a friend of mine, and we had these bacon chocolates, and I couldn't decide. I just kept taking bite after bite after bite and going, do I like this? Do I not like this? And by the end, I concluded, yeah, I think I do. Or sometimes you hear a song on the radio for the first time and you don't really like it very much, but after you've heard it several times because it's a new song and the radio is overplaying it like crazy, you begin to like it. You become increasingly familiar with the tune, you start to memorize the lyrics, you're humming along as you're driving. So despite your initial aversion, eventually you're like, yeah, it's a pretty good song, I like that. After a while, you might even start to prefer that song to others you liked initially. A key element of the mirror exposure effect is that it refers to the fact that people begin to like something more without any substantial reason other than familiarity. And research suggests that this holds true even when you aren't aware of having seen a specific stimulus. So they did a study where people reported liking a specific polygon that they saw several times compared to other polygons, even though A, polygons don't really have a whole lot of influence in our daily lives, and B, they didn't realize that they were exposed to it, so it was occurring below their conscious level. So in the next lecture, we'll talk about the biology of emotion, and we'll also talk about nonverbal expressions of emotion. We show emotion in a whole lot of different ways, with our bodies, with our faces, and so that's a really important topic to cover. So that will be coming up next.